You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the Atlanta child murders. Now, this was approximately 28 victims in a police department that didn't want to acknowledge the connections, as well as a suspect being picked up last minute and charged with murder. Now, some believe this case is solved. However, others believe that the wrong man has been locked up for decades. By the way, I post content like this all the time. It's my absolute passion to tell these victim stories, and if you would like to support me in doing so, all you have to do is subscribe, thumbs up this video, and leave a nice comment down below. I never make these videos in any sort of negative way, and I never want to harm anyone that I am talking about or their families. I am just bringing together the information of this case to shed light on it. So let's get back to the story. So it was 1979 in Georgia, and young boys would begin to go missing in Atlanta. This wasn't just one or two either. This was many, and still no one wanted to acknowledge the problem or even connect the cases, and this was all thought to begin in 1979. Now, this is when 14-year-old Edward Hope Smith, who went by Teddy, disappeared on July 21st. This was thought to be the first victim to go missing. Only 4 days later, a 14-year-old boy would go missing as well, named Alfred Evans, who went by Q. Now, it was said that one disappeared from a skating rink and the other from a movie theater. So both of these boys were just doing normal young boy activities. They were doing things that weren't bad at all. They were just having fun. However, they would then meet a tragic ending. Their bodies would be found together on August 7th in a wooded area, and Teddy had a .22 caliber gunshot wound in his upper back, and Q had been strangled. Now, they were found not too far apart on Niskey Lake Road. At this time, these two victims were thought to be the victims of a drug deal gone wrong, and so they were not looked into. The case was not really even acknowledged, and no one would have any idea that this would begin a murder spree that would last 2 years. On September 4th, 14-year-old Milton Harvey would go missing as well. He had gone to the bank for his mother, and he was riding his 10-speed yellow bike, but he would never make it home. Now, his bike would actually be found a week later in a remote area, but Milton would not be there. However, 2 months after that, he would be found deceased as well. I do want to add in here that, unfortunately, as much as I love to talk about each victim and who they were as a person, there was not this sort of information about them, mainly having to do with the fact that these cases wouldn't even be talked about for many years to come. Now, on October 21st, another boy would go missing. This time, he was a little younger, at 9 years old. His name was Yusuf Bell, and he was an honor student and such a good kid, and he had an elderly neighbor that often asked him to go to the store and buy things for her, and this time it was smokeless tobacco from his neighbor Ewell. And this time he would go to Reese Grocery, which was on McDaniel Street, only across the street from where he lived, and so it shouldn't have been that hard of a walk. He had been seen at the intersection of McDaniel and Fulton, and he had even walked back across the street and was almost home when witnesses would also say they had seen him get into a blue car. He would not make it home, and his mother was panicking. She begged for somebody to do something. She called him in as missing to the police department, and they wrote a report, but they didn't even search for him. I'm sure they told her he was just a runaway who would show up eventually. Yusuf had a 3-year-old sister who after this was completely terrified to go anywhere because that was her older brother that had been so strong in her eyes, and if he could be taken, she could too. Now, unfortunately, the next month on November 8th, Yusuf's body would be found inside of the E.P. Johnson Elementary School, which at this point was abandoned, and his cause of death was found to be strangulation. He had also been hit over the head twice, and the brown shorts he had been wearing when he went missing were still on him. However, they now had a piece of masking tape on them as well, which was thought to be strange. But after they found him, knew he was deceased, some fog would come down in the area, and Yusuf's sister would actually run outside and start running all around the area, and her mother said, "What are you doing?" And she said that she was looking for Yusuf because the fog came down so he could too. She believed this fog was heaven. 4 children now murdered, all from Atlanta and all black. And nobody would acknowledge that these could even be connected, that they were happening. They would not bring them to the attention of anybody, and this could have been a serial killer in the area. In fact, it was. It would become the next year, 1980, and these murders would still be happening. It was March 4th, and 12-year-old Angel Lennar had left her house that day at around 4 p.m. wearing an all-denim outfit to go to her friend's house to watch some Sanford and Sons, and that was the last time she would be seen. This would actually be the first female victim. She was called in as missing. A small search happened, really just from the community members, and the police insisted that she was, in fact, a runaway, and she just didn't want to be at home anymore. Nothing bad had happened to her. They would be so very wrong, because 6 days later she would be found in a vacant wooded area tied to a tree with electrical cord. She also had a pair of underwear stuffed in her mouth that were not her own, and she had been strangled to death. A day after Angel was found, another disappearance would occur. Now, these disappearances were getting closer and closer together. It was March 11th, and 10-year-old Jeffrey Mathis went on an errand for his mom to buy some cigarettes. He was wearing gray jogging pants, brown shoes, and a white and green shirt with $1 in his hand, but he would not be coming home. His mom said he knew better than to stay out past when he was supposed to, or to not come home, and a witness had seen him get into a blue car with a light-skinned man and a dark-skinned man, but she didn't know who they were. Now, by the time that Jeffrey's body was found, it was in a briar patch of woodlands, and it was so decomposed that they couldn't identify how he had died. At this point, Yusuf Bell, who was the 4th victim, his mother decided that enough was enough. If they weren't going to do something about what was happening, she was going to herself. She gathered other victims' parents, and she decided to form the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. And she said, if you don't realize you're in trouble until you're in trouble, you have no way of getting out. Her name was Camille, and she said that everybody was looking at them just like they were distraught parents who needed sympathy, and not that something was actually happening in the area. She said that no one even looked at them because not only were they poor, they were also black. Unfortunately, by themselves, they could not stop a killer, and on May 18th, another victim would be taken. This time it would be 14-year-old Eric Middlebrooks, who was a 14-year-old foster boy who had answered the phone at his foster home before hurrying off on his bike, and after that, he disappeared. Now, Eric often carried a hammer in order to fix his bike in case it broke down, which would have gave him a weapon of protection, so it was strange that something would have happened to him. However, it was said that prior to his disappearance, he had testified in a trial against 3 juveniles for robbing a bank, and it could have something to do with that. It wouldn't even be a full 48 hours before Eric would be found. He was in a garage in an Atlantic bar, and he was right next to his bike. This bar was also directly next door to Georgia Department of Offender Rehabilitation. Now, Eric's cause of death was actually blunt force trauma to the head, and he had stab wounds in his arms and his chest as well. But another odd factor was that he had his pockets inside out, and they also found a red fiber on his shoe. Now, at this point, Investigators really didn't use certain fibers for any sort of case, and so when the officers that had went to the scene had collected the fiber, brought it into the police department, they were almost laughed at and mocked for bringing in this fiber because no one believed it would do anything in this case. They would be very wrong about this. I wish I could say that this is where the victims stop, but they do not. Whoever was doing this was a complete monster, and no one was even looking for them. There was actually an officer who began to tell everybody at the police department, look, I think that there might be a serial killer on the loose, and they were threatened to be transferred to another police department to shut them up. Now, on June 9th, a 12-year-old named Christopher Richardson was on his way to the pool. He was last seen walking towards the recreation center in blue shorts, a light blue shirt, and blue tennis shoes. He was not found until much later. He was also in a different pair of swimming trunks, and his cause of death could not be determined. June 22nd, LaTanya Wilson would go missing from her apartment. She was only 7 years old. She lived with her parents in this apartment. She was by herself that day, and a witness had seen some man climbing into their apartment window and climbing back out with LaTanya. And there was also thought to be another man with this man that climbed through the window, but by the time LaTanya was found, her cause of death couldn't be determined either. But the day after LaTanya disappeared, Aaron Wyke disappeared from a grocery store. He was only 10 years old, and he had gone to Tanner's Corner Grocery. However, there was a witness that had seen a lot of what happened and even had a description of the individual that he had been with. This witness said that this was a 6-foot-tall, 180-pound black male who was approximately 30 years old and had a mustache and goatee. And these two, this man and Aaron, had gotten into a blue Chevrolet with 1 or 2 other men. This wouldn't be the last time Aaron would be spotted, though. He would be seen at another shopping center around 6 p.m. that evening. However, the next day he was found under a bridge, and his cause of death was asphyxiation from his broken neck from the fall. By July 6th, 2 boys would go missing in the same day. This was Anthony Carter, who was 9 years old, and Earl Lee Terrell, who was 10. They would both be found, and Anthony had died of multiple stab wounds, whereas Earl had died of strangulation. Earl had left the house that day in gold trunks with $2 in his hand to go to the swimming pool, and he had actually gotten in trouble there and was asked to leave, but from there he didn't make it home. It was said that Earl actually wanted to be a firefighter. He was such a good older brother, but now he was gone. 12 children were now missing and murdered. On July 17th, the Atlanta police finally assembled a task force to investigate these murders, and thank goodness they did, because these murders were not slowing down. It was now August 20th, and 13-year-old Clifford Jones would go missing. He would be found strangled next to a dumpster, and after this, because Clifford had actually been from out of the area, from another state, and had been in this area to visit relatives, this caught more national attention, and this is what is thought to really push them forward as far as investigating these further, because now more eyes were on them to do something about it. The next month, 11-year-old Darren Glass would get off his bus at an intersection and never be seen again. He was actually never found. But the month after that, Charles Stevens, who was 10 years old, would be found strangled on the side of the road. One seemed to be happening every month at this point. The next was November 1st, with 9-year-old Aaron Jackson being found to be strangled to death. Now, just when you think that this killer's MO, as far as the time frame, the time period in which he kills, was beginning to be something they could look into, it was changed. The next murder would only be 9 days later. This was 16-year-old Patrick Rogers, who would be found bludgeoned to death. Now at this point, the FBI was finally called in to help, because some of these victims were said to be taken across state lines. So of course, FBI could now come in to help. There was also 5 of the nation's top homicide detectives that were sent down to help out everybody as well in any way they could. They were finding that some of the victims had known each other, had lived close, and it wasn't all in one area, but they mostly came from a certain community. For so long, the investigators didn't want to believe what was happening, and they said it was because they didn't want the city's reputation to be tarnished, and it would be super damaged if anybody found out about this. But Yusuf's mother, Camille, had a different experience and a different theory. She said, "The more we talked, we found that none of us had been able to get the police to keep in touch with us. They wouldn't call us back. Nothing was being done." The community at this point was even holding weekly marches with signs that said "Save the children" because no one was listening to them. But now with the police involved, they didn't have a choice. The police assembled an ATKID investigation team, and they also were beginning to have the news report on the case every single day. So everybody everywhere was kind of finding out about what had actually been happening. A reward of $100,000 was even posted for anybody who had information, and it was actually laid out in front of the mayor in a broadcast about the reward to show that they actually had the money. This is actually when Muhammad Ali gave $400,000 to this reward fund, making it a grand total of $500,000. With all of this combined, there was finally a bigger community who were willing to help than just the victims' families, and I'm sure this was so relieving for them who had suffered for so long with the fact that nobody seemed to care. And now they were getting so much coverage, but unfortunately this didn't stop whoever this killer was, and the fear and the crime continued. And it was now 1981, 2 years after the murders had begun, and they were still occurring. President Reagan even got involved at this point, dispatching 2 Justice Departments to help in Atlanta. But on January 3rd, the next murder victim would be taken. This was 14-year-old Luby Jeter, and he was a sophomore in high school, a great student, and he was actually a really hard worker too. He would actually go to the shops and sell air fresheners just to make some money in his free time, and this is actually what he was doing when he vanished. But he had been with a friend who had seen Luby talking to this older man, and after Luby went missing that day, this friend would actually go to investigate and help them with a sketch, and this was thought to be the first look at this serial killer. But Luby was found strangled after that, unfortunately. 19 days later, 15-year-old Terry Pugh would go missing as well, and he was actually friends with Luby. And this time, after he vanished, an anonymous caller would call in saying where his body could be found, and it was found on the side of the road, and he was strangled by a chokehold. Now, he also had scratches all over his body. Now, you think with constant watch from the community, these killings would be harder to accomplish, but this killer didn't seem to be having any problems. It was almost like he just camouflaged in, that he blended in well with the community, he didn't cause any alarm for anybody, and that is when it was thought, it was profiled, that this killer must be black. It was said a white person could not easily travel in black neighborhoods without creating a great deal of suspicion. Now, profilers at the time were so new that many didn't even know what they did. They had said they believed he was an intelligent man who was desperate for attention and could possibly relate to children in a way, and that he possibly had an obsession with police. But many of the actual police didn't even want to listen to these profilers, saying that they weren't real cops and that they didn't know what they were talking about. Little did they know that profiling would become such a huge thing in the future and would cause them to be able to catch so many killers. But they didn't catch him just yet. It was February 6th, and 11-year-old Patrick Baltazar disappeared. Now, it's heartbreaking because Patrick actually had heard about all these killings and was determined to find this killer and get the reward money for his family to help out. He didn't believe that this killer could harm him. He was such a strong little boy, and he was streetwise and not afraid. And it was actually found that prior to his disappearance, he had actually called a payphone saying that a man in a brown Cadillac was following him and his friend, but the police thought it was a prank call and didn't even send anyone. He was so well liked, but now he was gone, and his classmates actually created a poem in his honor, which I will put in right now.
Patrick Baltazar, our schoolmate, you came to school, though sometimes late, but you were never mean to anyone. You tried to help people and thought it was fun. Then one night, one terrible night, you didn't come home, not even at daylight. Something's happened to that boy, the people said. Patrick is missing. Is Patrick dead? We cried some,
and we bowed our heads, and hoped for your safety, and prayers were said. Oh God, please bring back that missing boy. When he returns, we will shout for joy. The police and the news people came and went. In all our hearts was no content. No one could rest until we knew whatever had happened to you. Then one day your body was found out in the woods on the cold, cold ground. Someone killed you and dumped you there. It was a mad, cruel person who did not care. There was not a word about how you died. It is no wonder that we all cried. Patrick, we miss you and wish you knew how much your schoolmates grieve for you.
Now, they had no idea that Patrick's case would be the reason for some of these cases to be actually connected. You see, the fibers found on Patrick's body were the same as 5 other previous victims, and before this, they really didn't put any weight on the fibers. They didn't think they mattered, but now they realized that they really could. Unfortunately, this was leaked to the public that they were looking into fibers on the bodies. They were finding this evidence, and of course, this killer must have heard this and known that he had to get rid of more evidence on the bodies, and that is when they would begin to show up in the river nude, which of course would lose all trace of those fibers. Now that is when 15-year-old Curtis Walker would go missing. He had dreamed of becoming an illustrator in Hollywood, but 13 days after Patrick, he would be found strangled in the river. On March 2nd, a 15-year-old Joseph Bell would have the same thing happen to him. He was a hardworking, friendly guy, and a witness even said he'd gotten into a white station wagon before he disappeared. The same exact thing would happen to Timothy Hill, who was 13 years old, 11 days later. At this point, the community was absolutely devastated, even more than they were before. Everybody feared going outside. They kept their children close. Some even took them out of school and told them they couldn't go outside to play. Atlanta even put in curfews as well. Nearly $1 million was given to the community for youth involvement programs, and there was also a 24-hour hotline for tips and counseling that was set up. Now, the city was spending so much money on the overtime for police officers and for these searches that they were really struggling, and that is when Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. would offer to perform to raise money for Atlanta, and they actually would raise $100,000. Psychics, dog teams, and volunteers would spend their weekends searching for bodies, and vigilante groups even formed with bats as weapons. People were terrified, but they were also determined to make this stop. Unfortunately, once again, it would not. On March 20th, Eddie Duncan would go missing, and strangely enough, he wasn't a child or even a teen. He was 21 years old, and he had been found strangled as well. 2 days later, it would be 20-year-old Larry Rogers, another adult, and he was actually mentally disabled and found strangled as well. The last time he had been seen was slumped over in a station wagon. 3 days later, the same would happen to 23-year-old Michael McIntosh, and it was now April 13th, and the FBI director would announce that they believed that they had the killer of 4 of the children. However, they didn't have enough evidence yet to prove it or to bring them in. That April, 28-year-old John Porter would be found stabbed to death, where 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne would be strangled, and they were both found nude in the river. Jimmy had just taken his girlfriend to the train station when he vanished. These two were actually ex-convicts who had recently gotten out of prison for burglary, and it was thought that all of these adults going missing obviously had some sort of childlike reason why they were targeted, whether they appeared childlike, acted childlike. May 11th, William Barrett, who was 17 years old, was strangled as well and found about a mile away from his home in a wooded area, and this was on a curb. Wasn't too far into the woods, but a witness had said that he had run out of gas about a mile away from where this crime scene was, and he had seen a black man standing over this area, observing the location where this body would be found, before driving away in a white over blue Cadillac. Little did they know this would be the last child or teen victim, but it would not be the last kill. 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater would disappear on May 22nd after witnesses saw him at a theater holding hands with another man. Now, after this, he would disappear, and at this point, the FBI decided that most of these bodies were being found in rivers at this point. So, they were going to stake out the Chattahoochee River throughout the night to make sure that none of these bodies would be dumped, and if they were, they could catch the person doing so. Now, Bob Campbell was actually doing so that May 22nd. This was actually the last day they scheduled to stake out. They had had a month-long period. They hadn't seen anything happen prior, so this was the last day. And thankfully, they were still there, because Bob would hear a splash. This was just before 3 a.m. and Bob immediately radioed up to the investigators who were on the South Cobb Drive Bridge to see if there was anybody up there. And that is when they saw the brake lights of a 1970 Chevrolet station wagon turning around on the bridge, and they immediately followed this car and they pulled them over. Now, this was a man wearing a baseball cap who said he had no idea what they were talking about. He hadn't stopped his vehicle. He hadn't just turned around in the middle of the bridge. And they searched his car and found really nothing significant to say that he was a killer. Although they did get fibers and dog hair from his vehicle just in case they needed it in the future, but after that, they decided they had to let him go. 2 days later, in the Chattahoochee River, Nathaniel Cater would be found in the nude. He had been strangled, and there were actually fibers still on his body. That is when they realized they might have let a serial killer go. Now, at this point, they began to look into this guy and his alibi. He had said that he was a talent scout who was going to audition a woman named Cheryl Johnson in Smyrna, and he was headed out to her place and couldn't find the address. At this point, police decided to track down Cheryl to just ask her about this man, but not only could they not find any sort of information about Cheryl and this man's appointment, they didn't find any information about Cheryl, as though she didn't exist. They had also seen a bag which had gloves and a 24-inch nylon cord in this man's car, but they didn't think much of it. However, now they were thinking this nylon cord could be the murder weapon. The first word out of this man's mouth when he was pulled over was, "This is about those boys, isn't it?" And he followed up with, "I don't think the news agencies are covering it adequately. Do you?" At this point, they brought in this man for questioning, and once again, they didn't have enough to keep him, so they let him go. His father said that his son was being questioned because of littering, and after this man would actually call a press conference to his home where he lived with his parents, and he didn't want his face being shown, but he said that he was being questioned in these murders, that he was the prime suspect but that he didn't know any of the victims or what happened to them. The suspect seemed to love the attention which he would get, because investigators would begin putting out lawn chairs and watching him directly across the street right in front of his home, and news reporters would stand right behind them to start filming him and get a good story. And eventually he began to get mad at this, and he would take the investigators on wild goose chases around town, making them think that he was just going off somewhere to do something bad when he was just roaming to get them away from his house. By June 7th, 1981, 2 years after these murders had begun, the FBI would say they finally had enough to arrest the suspect. However, the local police were saying that they didn't even have enough to really question him. But on June 21st, 23-year-old Wayne Bertram Williams would be arrested for the murder of Nathaniel Cater. Neighbors had reported that this man, once he was questioned, had been outside burning things in his backyard. He would also take boxes to his car and drive away with them, never to be seen again. He was actually a 5'7", fairly thin man who was a music producer and a freelance photographer with a resume full of lies. Now, the Chevrolet station wagon he had been driving actually belonged to his parents, who he still lived with. Their home was searched, and some of the fibers from his car were found to be in his home. Now, they actually matched the carpet, and Wayne had allegedly been handing out flyers at these different places in the area asking for children from 11 to 21 to audition for his new singing group called Gemini, which was supposed to be the new Jackson 5. The nylon cord that was seen in the back of the vehicle but wasn't collected couldn't be found after they arrested him. It was said that he had gotten rid of it, however some say he never had it at all. Now, Wayne would be given a polygraph test at this point, and he was very calm, but after every question, he would ask basically how he did and what it meant, and he would end up failing the polygraph 3 different times, and he was so surprised by this. Now, the fibers from his car matched the carpet at his home, but it also matched 2 victims. And that was only so far. After his arrest, 2 witnesses would come forward about Wayne Williams. Now, one was named Robert Henry, who was the one who had seen Nathaniel Cater holding hands with a man. He had said this man was Wayne Williams. And now another witness was a woman who worked at Wayne's recording studio at the time, who said that at one point Wayne had walked in with scratches all over his arms, and she asked what had happened. He said he'd just fallen into a bush, but that was very strange because these scratches were in different directions on his arm, and a bush really couldn't have done that, and she was very suspicious but didn't want to ask anymore. They had enough to connect this killer to the murder of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. Now, although there was a statement from the FBI saying that Wayne was looking pretty good for a good percentage of the killings, it was said that Wayne often spoke badly about black children and considered them to be weighing down his race. The trial would begin on January 6th, and the fibers were the biggest evidence they really had against him. They said they had evidence from the unique yellowish-green carpet, a bedspread, and a yellow blanket from his bedroom that investigators claimed to find at first and then never saw again, as well as dog hairs from their German Shepherd, and these were all from the home and thought to be found on victims as well. It was said 19 different sources of fibers and hairs were matched to fibers on a number of victims. At first, Wayne was very calm. However, he decided to take the stand, and at this point he would begin to scream after being questioned, standing up and saying, "Do you want the real Wayne Williams now? You've got him." And nearly 2 months later, with Wayne pleading not guilty, he would be found guilty after 11 hours of deliberation. And this would give him 2 consecutive life terms. But this wasn't the end of this case or Wayne Williams. You see, that March, the Special Task Force would end up closing 22 cases, saying that they could all be linked to Wayne Williams. However, 3 years later, a program would air saying that Wayne was actually railroaded or sent to prison without a fair trial by false evidence. And that is when the attorneys ran with this. They requested a new trial, saying that Wayne was actually sacrificed to racial harmony in Atlanta, and that a white killer killing all of these black children would have created a race war, which is what everyone was trying to prevent. This request would be denied. However, in 2005, this case would be reopened because they were said to be looking into several of these cases, including Aaron, Curtis, Yusuf, William, and Patrick, and they said they doubted William was guilty of all of them. Not much was done in regards to reopening these cases. However, a new suspect was theorized, and this was Charles T. Sanders. He was said to praise these crimes, and he admitted to the murder of Luby, or was said to. He was also a member the KKK. Now, he said he didn't have anything to do with these murders as well. There are conflicting sources saying that sometimes he confessed, sometimes he did not. He didn't necessarily deny it, but he said he didn't really have anything to do with it. He never confessed to having anything to do with it. So the police decided to watch him for 7 weeks, and this is when the crimes were still happening, and 4 victims were killed during this point, and nothing really showed anything suspicious while they were watching Charles, other than one time over the tapped phone lines they heard them say, "Go find another kid." At this point, Charles and 2 of his brothers volunteered to take a polygraph test. They passed, but it was said that these men of the KKK claimed they would kill a black child every month, until things blew up. So some people think that they got away with it, that they were the true killers, and many believe Wayne had killed maybe some of them, or maybe none of them. It was a scapegoat. But most believe there are still killers out there, and there were many killers having to do with the Atlanta child murders. It wasn't just one. Even Yusuf's mother doesn't believe that Wayne killed her son. Now in 2007, DNA testing was done once again of the dog hair, and this time it found that the hair on the bodies contained the same mitochondrial DNA of Wayne's dog. This was like a 1 in 100 kind of thing, but they couldn't exactly say that it was his dog. Human hairs were also tested. They weren't conclusive to saying it was Wayne, but they also couldn't deny that it was him either. In 2010, CNN would actually make a documentary on this case, and they would question Wayne in jail. He would say that no one ever saw him choke a person or harm a person, and he thinks that fear convicted him because the police knew that they needed to catch someone who wasn't white. He also said he knew he was his own worst enemy because when he stood up and he said, you want to see the real Wayne Williams? He could see the fear in the jury's faces, and he basically knew he messed up. Wayne said he was always out at night because he used to work at the news station at night, and so that was just kind of the time period he was awake, and that he never stopped on the bridge that night. The nylon cord never existed, and he also said that he once worked for the CIA. Well, not worked for them, but trained for them. You see, he had written that he, when he was 19, was recruited to be in this training program by the CIA where they would go out on weekends and he would learn unarmed combat skills, such as putting someone in a chokehold to kill them. Now, he had wrote this, but he wouldn't talk about it in the interview. He'd also at one point said, "I didn't kill anyone," while he had a smile on his face. But a witness who had once said that Nathaniel Cater had been with Wayne Williams had then retracted that statement, saying that he had been forced to say that. However, since saying he had been forced to say that, he now says it was Wayne Williams, and it's just kind of a confusing mess of this witness going back and forth. Now, Wayne still claims his innocence, and many believe him. Even FBI agent Douglas said, "Despite what his detractors and accusers maintain, I believe there's no strong evidence linking him to all, or even most of the deaths and disappearances of children in that city between 1979 and 1981. Young black and white children continue to die mysteriously in Atlanta." Now in 2019, the Atlanta police actually announced that they plan to retest evidence once again because of the mayor, and the mayor said, "It may be there is nothing left to be tested, but I do think history will judge us by our actions, and we will be able to say we tried. We hope to let them know that we have done all that we can to make sure their memories are not forgotten, and in the truest sense of the word, to let the world know that Black lives do matter. Now for me, this is a very hard one to distinguish. I mean, do we have the right man behind bars? Was Wayne extremely good at manipulation and making us think he wasn't a killer, or was he a scapegoat that has been behind bars for murders he didn't commit for decades? Or did they charge a killer by accident because they didn't have enough evidence, but they just by chance caught him and put him behind bars and stopped a whole bunch of other murders from happening, and really they shouldn't have been able to with the small amount of evidence they had. We saw from the fact that it took them so long to even acknowledge that these Black children were being murdered, to think that they wouldn't have wanted a white killer to cause an uproar, an uprising that they had to attend to. You know, putting a Black man in jail for the crimes could have been a way that they stopped all of that. It's horrific to think about, but it could be. But in a way, I would hate for us to say that if Wayne really is a killer, a serial killer at that, and we're all just sitting here being manipulated by him and saying that he's some innocent person when his victims are looking down saying, no, you have the right killer, you know? You know, I tend to like to go with the victims' families and how they feel about it, and a lot of the families do think that Wayne is innocent. Love to hear what you think about this down below. Please be respectful. This case really breaks my heart that these children were not treated in the same way that other victims would be, and it breaks my heart that this still happens today. It's not something that just happened in the past, and it continues to happen, and it's disgusting, quite honestly, and I am glad I could share their cases, but I wish I would have been able to when it was happening, to give them coverage and to make people hear what was happening, to give them a voice. And I'm happy that I could do that today and bring you the case, your thoughts on it. Did they really get justice? Is their killer really behind bars? So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye. Also, if you want to know what I did for my makeup, I have a video that went up on my second channel. I'll link it down below. I talk about makeup and movies. So, yeah. Okay, bye.